resistance is futile. And I think what we're going to see is an arms race of the power of AI and the power of the tools necessary to identify AI as AI. That's really the pressure point, is not necessarily what AI can do, it's how it does it and how clear it is or transparent it is that it's AI doing that and not a human being.
Welcome to Technovation. I'm your host, Peter High. My guest today is Tom Murphy. For the past 11 years, Tom has been the Senior Vice President of Information Technology and University Chief Information Officer at the University of Pennsylvania, an Ivy League university in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, that was founded by Ben Franklin in 1740, making it the fifth oldest university in the United States. Tom is a member of CIO.com's prestigious CIO Hall of Fame based on his private sector experience prior to joining Penn. He was a CIO of 5 private sector companies, including DaVita, AmerisourceBergen, and Royal Caribbean. At a time of great dynamism on college campuses, I look forward to getting Tom's perspectives on innovation, on the challenges that universities face, and more through this conversation. Tom, welcome to Technovation. I should say welcome back. It's great to speak with you again.
Thanks, Peter. It's great to be here. I appreciate the invitation.
I always look forward to our conversations, Tom. Tom, you have, for more than a decade now, been the Chief Information Officer of the University of Pennsylvania. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your purview as CIO. What is it when you're in your span of responsibility?
Great question, and one that surprises a lot of people. I run what we call the central IT organization at the university. So it's called Information Systems and Computing, and we provide all of the core networking and storage, data center, data management, video, voice, and we manage all of the enterprise applications that run both the academic and the administrative enterprise. There are about 300 people in my organization, and there are more than 1,000 IT professionals at Penn, which will give you a sense for the degree of decentralization that we deal with. There are about 45 units, both divisions and schools, that run their own IT. And there's no authority that the central IT organization has over the schools and centers. So we do a lot of work to try to manage and to create community, to look for common solutions that will work across 12 very, very different schools. So that's where we fit. We fit in the middle of this vast decentralized IT infrastructure that runs the university.
And talk a bit about that role of influence, if you will. Very interesting. You've got IT leaders across the 45 units, as you put it, and various team members across all of those as well. As you think about those aspects that are best done commonly versus those that will be unique to a business school or a medical school or a veterinary school or the various other schools across the University of Pennsylvania, how do you think about, first of all, determining what those are and the extent to which you then need to make a case for doing some things more commonly? I would love to understand a bit more about the approach.
The approach is very different than it was 11 years ago. I will say that. We've made a lot of progress in establishing credibility and the value of IT at scale. I think many of the folks that watch your podcast understand that great IT starts with IT at scale. That's a challenge for us because so many groups do their own thing. We always look for common ways of accomplishing goals, but I'll go back. When I first arrived, we had 18 email systems on campus. That obviously creates a tremendous challenge with cross intra-department and inter-school communication. None of the schools or centers wanted to give up their bespoke email solution. So what I did, first of all, to me, that was the poster child for decentralization gone mad. So I used that to try to change the behavior of the IT organizations across the institution. And I did it by getting feedback from the faculty and researchers who really run the place, that they were frustrated at the inability to communicate to their peers across schools because of the different email systems. So I just brought a group of IT professionals from across the schools and centers. Instead of my team doing it myself, we put them in a room with Gartner, we gave them a bunch of pizza, and we told them to come up with the right university-wide solution. And we did it. So we broke some of the mythology that exists at the university about what you can and cannot do, And then that opened up a lot of opportunities for me to challenge other reasons that we do the things that we do. It's everything at Penn takes a long time. I talk about Penn time versus Tom time, and there's a reason for that. And these institutions have been around, in our case, for going on 300 years. There is a pace that is acceptable at the university, and I have to follow along that pace in order to get things done. I mean, the interesting thing, and I think you and I have spoken about this in the past, is that I am accountable to senior administration and to the trustees for everything that happens across the university relative to both information security and information technology. And yet, as we're talking about, I really don't have any authority over the majority of the IT work and information security work that happens across campus. It's a delicate challenge to work through. I have more success with some schools and centers than others, but it's much better, as I said, than it was 12 years ago.
Fascinating. I love your thought process of going to the very people who are intended to be the beneficiaries of the work that you are doing to understand where they are pleased or not, and using that as a portion of the basis for the case for change when that's necessary. It brings up an interesting point, which you also alluded to. You serve students, professors, administrators, you just noted trustees, to some extent the parents of students who are the ones who are paying for their educations in most cases. How do you think about the needs across these constituents? You've talked about the interactions with some of them, gleaning from some of those constituents what's working well or what's not, what needs to change, what needs to stay the same, et cetera. But I wonder, with so many different personas who are influential, as you think about where to exert yours, how do you interact with each of those?
The reason that Penn brought me to take the CIO role back in 2013 was they realized that they had allowed most of their enterprise solutions to deprecate to the point that it was actually hurting the university in our ability to compete effectively against our IB peers. And I had a background, as you know, in doing a lot of very heavy enterprise solution lifts. So when I came on board, I was the first university CIO. So that was an intentional move on their part to elevate the role. And I also was the first one to report both to the academic officer, the provost, and to the chief administrative officer, who's kind of a combination of the chief operating officer and the chief financial officer. So I had a little bit more credibility coming in and talking about replacing all of these systems, which included academic systems, student systems, administrative systems, almost everything that you can imagine is necessary to run a university, we have replaced with the exception of our financial system. Those have all benefited the constituents that you mentioned. So our entire undergraduate admissions solutions have changed. All of our we call them customer relationship management solutions, but of course they're more like student and parent relationships. All of our social media has evolved over the last 13 years to accommodate student and parental needs. We just finished replacing all of our alumni and donor systems with Salesforce. And we also took live about 6 years ago an online donor solution, which no other Ivy League had, also allowed for cryptocurrency donations, which you may know December 31st is the most significant transaction volume in any university's giving for tax purposes. So using the cloud, we were able to ramp up and handle this massive transaction volume on this new online solution that we created for donors. And we saw about a 12% increase year over year in donations. So we hit every single constituent that you mentioned, both directly and indirectly. And when you think about it, it makes sense. I mean, we run all of the enterprise solutions on campus. They touch everybody. And honestly, that's the great part of this job. It's no different than any other CIO job where, I've always argued that we have the same purview as the CEO. It's probably the only C-level executive who sees more or the same as the CIO does because we work across the entire organization. It's the same at Penn. I work across the entire institution in order to get things done. And that's, again, it's the great part of the job. And it touches all of those constituents that you mentioned.
Yeah, fascinating. I wonder, you've already begun to mention, I'm sure we'll get further into some of the nuances of being a university CIO relative to a private sector CIO. You worked for multiple Fortune 500 companies as a chief information officer prior to this. What drew you, given some of the challenges you've already noted that I'm sure were maybe not crystal clear, but at least you knew a little bit about in coming into the role. What drew you to an institution like Penn that had so many differences relative to where you came from?
The short answer is a recruiter called me, and I immediately said, "You must have the wrong phone number." Because I do very large Fortune 500 companies who are aggressively for profit. Having said that, I worked in tour and travel. I've worked in wholesale pharmaceutical distribution, a little bit in healthcare, and I've always enjoyed going across industries. I think the CIO role more than most. I often say moving from industry to industry is like moving to a new country, right? You got to learn the language, got to learn the culture, but the application of what we do is largely the same. In higher education, it's more like going from Earth to Mars. It is so fundamentally different. Everything. We don't talk about return on investment here. We don't talk about the fundamental financials that drive IT investments. I mean, obviously, financials are very important here, and it's a regular course of conversation, but it's a very different perspective on IT investments. And I'll just give you a quick example. We implemented Workday HR and payroll. And during the assessment process, we wanted to do a process decomposition in order to figure out how do you make a cloud solution work when you have 12 schools who all do HR and payroll differently. I mean, ultimately, it all ends up in one place centrally, but the way that you get there is fundamentally different from one school to another. And we had to harmonize those processes. Nobody at the university had ever been through anything like that, any kind of decomposition of process. So one thing that really interested me was starting from scratch. There were two things that I thought I would get out of this. One was exercising muscles that, candidly, you just don't have to exercise that much in a corporate setting. In corporate, when you want to get something done, just like any place, the CIO is a great salesperson, right? Our job is to sell complicated things that people don't really understand, nor do they want to spend money to buy, right? That's the CIO role. In corporate, though, there's always a C-level executive, whether it's the CEO or the CFO generally, who will say, this is what we're doing, now go execute. In higher ed, there is no such individual. Because of the nature of universities, we don't mandate anything. Everything is a policy that's suggested. A decision to move forward with Workday and replacing HR and payroll processes across all of the schools and centers, that's not something that the president or the provost or the EVP is going to say, thou shalt. It's something that I need to go around. I need to convince people. We need to put a coalition of the willing together. We need to build governance models, things that we do in corporate settings, but X 100 in higher education. I mean, the old saying that 19 to 1 is a tie in higher education is absolutely true. You have to bring everybody across the finish line in order to get something started, which is why things take so much longer in higher education. But so the answer to your question is, I learned so much about how to do things that were so fundamentally different than the way I had to do them in corporate. I really felt like I developed an entirely new CIO toolkit during the course of the last 12 years. And the other thing that I was looking forward to, sort of starting fresh, starting in a new industry that was so different, was being able to take 30 years of experience in, I think, 6 different companies, 6 different cultures, and trying to bring some of that to the university to positively impact the way they think about and apply technology in Penn setting. And that's been great. It's why I've stayed here for this long.
Really great perspectives there, Tom. Thank you for sharing that. I wanted to also note you've worked across multiple administrations at Penn, two presidencies, a couple of interim presidents as well. And I wonder how do changes in leadership lead to new priorities for the IT department? You mentioned the sometimes glacial pace of change. the fact that priorities may take years to get accomplished. I love your 19 to 1 point as well. But to what extent does a new leader, like a new CEO, choose to put his or her fingerprints on the plan, and to what extent then does that lead to consequential shifts in areas of focus for your team, for example?
It's a good question, and one that I'll answer two ways. One is that most new presidents come in and develop a university-wide strategic plan. It's a very common, I don't see it as much in CEOs who come to new companies, although they assess and they'll come up with their own plan. But my experience with these new presidents is they come in and they want to start a whole new strategic plan that includes, building a campaign and funding the new strategy through donations and gifts and so forth. So it's a whole process, quite different than a corporate setting. Those university-wide strategies will obviously influence my strategies. So in that sense, there's a relatively direct connection to a new president coming in. Having said that, through the 30 years that I practiced IT up until the university, we saw a steady evolution of the CIO becoming more and more relevant and part of the overall C-level executive suite, right? In the boardroom and so forth. In higher education, that really hasn't happened. And one of the challenges for me and opportunities, I guess, is that IT still, in a way, is relegated to the back room, right? The way that we grew out of in the corporate setting. IT is really probably 10 years behind, 15 years behind, in many cases, where we've been with the corporation in terms of where the CIO sits. So I had to accept a certain amount of position that was different than I was used to at AmerisourceBergen or Royal Caribbean or any of those, where I was literally sitting at the table helping make the strategy. Here, I execute the strategy, and I'm at some tables, but not other tables. And the mission of the university is what drives our focus. IT does not drive that. And you talk to enough CIOs, today we are largely driving the most significant strategies in most of the Fortune 500 companies, if not all. That it's very different here. I'm driving a lot of strategy, but it's layers below what the faculty and researchers and senior administration leaders necessarily see. And so it is very different. I don't know if I explained that well, but that's the way it works.
Yeah, very interesting. No, I appreciate that you explained that quite well. And it's interesting to understand again some of the nuances, especially across the variety of modes in which you've operated as a CIO. Another thing you're witnessing is, like many of us are across our lives, is the emergence of generative artificial intelligence, which is certainly in the minds, on the lips of so many of your peer chief information officers and beyond, well beyond. And the implications to the educational process are profound. There are many who worry about, is this going to, and I'm speaking to a former English major, is this going to make it more difficult for people to learn to write, that the writing will be done for them to some extent. And so therefore, that among a variety of reasons, one might argue that there needs to be a governor over how broadly this is implemented in a campus, for example. There are many other implications, security implications, and beyond as well. I wonder, what is your perspective in seeing the implementation of generative artificial intelligence in a place like Penn, and how do you see this evolving, at least as we sit here today?
The big question, right? Resistance is futile, to be perfectly honest. And I think what we're going to see is an arms race of the power of AI and the power of the tools necessary to identify AI as AI. To me, that's really the pressure point, is not necessarily what AI can do, it's how it does it and how clear it is or transparent it is that it's AI doing that and not a human being. At least for the next, I don't know, 3 to 5 years, it feels to me like that's where the friction is very clearly. And we're seeing it in higher ed. The immediate reaction of most faculty was fear, loathing, and terror. It was, this is the end of higher education. It's the end of education as we know it. It's all going to be cheating now. None of these students are going to be, learning the way they've traditionally learned. And I think it took about a month of pivot to realize that, yes, this is challenging. Yes, it's different and novel. And we need to figure out how to incorporate it into the education process and our curriculum instead of fighting it and trying to build walls around it. And I think you probably remember there were a lot of stories about elementary and high schools in particular trying to wall off AI as being even available in these schools, which was, of course, not possible nor practical. So we quickly pivoted to this is here, this is real, this needs to be incorporated as appropriately into your curriculum. And I think the majority of faculty have embraced that as appropriate. The key to us is having tools that enable faculty to easily determine if plagiarism has happened. That right now is a big question. People don't really show their work in mathematics anymore. So I don't know if that's as big a deal. And you've heard the comparison to the calculator or any other tool that's come along and its impact in us embracing it and figuring out how to use it. So that's our perspective. Build it into the curriculum, make it part of the education process. Resistance is futile, so wrap your arms around it and try to figure it out how to make it supercharge the education process as opposed to the alternative. I will say, personal opinion, this may be the engine or the fuel necessary to move institutions faster towards 3-year degrees. I think that if you look at where Congress is most focused, it's around the ROI of universities and the value that students are deriving and how that manifests itself into lifelong earnings and so forth. If we can channel AI to improve the learning experience and the velocity of the learning experience, then we could realistically deliver a Penn undergraduate degree in 3 years as opposed to 4. And while that's possible today, just because of, as you know, the challenge of the academic environment here, we generally discourage people trying to graduate in 3 years, although plenty of people do it. But could this become the norm because of the application of novel technology remains to be seen. But I think beyond AI, and of course, that's all anybody wants to talk about now instead of information security with the trustees, I think about the intersection of mobile, cloud, high advanced networking. Remember, we were talking about that intersection was going to change everything. And of course, it did in ways that we both expected and did not expect. And I sort of see that happening with AI, advanced compute, quantum computing, and products like Apple's Vision Pro. I think that there's tremendous application for the convergence of these technologies in higher education. I also think our students are already native social media, native online. Now they're going to be native, artificial intelligence, virtual reality, all of these technologies that are converging and made possible because of some of these advances. I expect to see in just a couple of years a lot more of all of these technologies in a converged way becoming more relevant and pervasive on campus. And I think that's what I'm watching really with a lot of interest, is how fast we see these converge. Virtual reality has moved very slowly, but I think miniaturization and battery technology is improving very rapidly. So all of these things coming together make for some interesting potential future applications to higher education.
Yeah, fascinating thoughts there. Really appreciate you sharing that. It brings to mind also a question I wanted to ask you, which is how collaborative on topics like these and others are your peers as university chief information officers? When you were at, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, when you were the CIO of AmerisourceBergen, you probably weren't convening with McKesson's and Cardinal Health's chief information officers and opening the kimono to a dramatic degree because of the fierce competition between you. And it's not to say there's no competition between universities, but certainly the extent to which there is, it's very, very different. I'm curious, to what extent do you gather together with and share perspectives and plans or strategies with your peer chief information officers?
I think this was one of the most significant surprises to me, most unexpected when I arrived, which is the degree of relationship amongst the CIOs in the Ivy Leagues. We call it the Ivy Plus. So for the CIOs, it's the 8 ancient Ivies, and then it's Duke, Stanford, MIT, and Chicago. So we have 12 CIOs in what we call the CIO Ivy Plus group. And all of the C-level executives have Ivy Plus groups that they meet with. We meet twice a year in person on a campus. Peter, we talk about everything. There is nothing that's off limits. We talk about our organizations. We talk about the vendors we're using. We're talking about those negotiations as long as there aren't NDAs in place. Everything is fair game. I would have gone to jail if I had these conversations with my peers at McKesson and Cardinal. So that was a really significant difference for me. It helped so much in the first year or two as I was making this transition from Earth to Mars, when every day I was saying, what the F? Just nothing made sense coming from where I came from. And having this group of people who, most of them had grown up in higher ed, there were a few who had come from corporate like I had, but it was almost like therapy sessions. Just going and saying, can you believe this? Can you believe that? And why would this happen? And they all had perfectly reasonable explanations for why those things happen in higher education, and in fact had stories that were far worse than mine. So it was a great opportunity. It continues to be something that I participate in regularly, and it is one of those fundamental differences from corporate. I thought of another a story that I wanted to tell you about how different it is between corporate and higher education. And this happened in my very first week at Penn. I was invited to a meeting with facilities, real estate, and other groups. And it turned out we were talking about the 100-year campus plan. They meant it. They were planning for 100 years what was going to happen on our 300-acre location. And it just killed me. I mean, I came from a place where we were focused on the next quarter, and that was it. And maybe a 1-year, 2-year, 5-year strategy. Here we were talking about a 100-year plan for campus, and they meant it. So that's another way that things are very different in higher education.
Yeah, that's a great story. I appreciate that. And what a revelation it must have been in recognizing the degree of collaboration across your peer group. I'm sure that's a cause for great comfort and perhaps some therapy as well at times. Yeah, as you mentioned earlier, Tom, you've been a chief information officer 6 times over at companies like DaVita and AmerisourceBergen, Royal Caribbean, Bristol Hotels and Resorts, Omni Hotels, et cetera, and now Penn, of course. And as you reflect on your career and other meaningful roles that you've had, I wonder what difference makers there were along the way that contributed to your success, and perhaps tuning your response as towards people who might be a degree or two removed from the heights you've reached to give them some access to what, as I say, were the difference makers that propelled you to these heights.
There were a lot of people who have had influence on me, both positive and negative, and how I approach this job. But the most important influencers start with my father, and I'll be totally cliche about this. My father was a business person as well, and very successful. And the one thing that he told me that I've told hundreds of people since then is that you should always hire people smarter than you, and then let them do what you hired them to do. Get out of their way. You mentioned I was an English major. It helped being an English major coming into IT post college, knowing nothing. I literally knew nothing about the field I was moving into. And that helped me a lot because I had to depend on the people who actually knew, no matter what level they were at, to help guide me as I learned about the profession. And so I think this notion of having the courage to hire people who are going to challenge you and be smarter than you, and having the courage to allow them just to execute without getting in their space has been a tremendous contributor to my success, and I think for the many people that I've tried to mentor along the way. What that requires is a certain amount of humility, and I think that is really what is underlying the value of that, is trying to maintain your humility. And I will tell you, there have been times when I've struggled with that, and people have quickly brought me down to earth. And this is another person who's made a huge difference is my wife, who doesn't really tolerate my ego when it gets out of control. So I think that it helps to have people who keep you grounded no matter what you're doing or how you're doing it or how far you've come in your career, pulling you back down to earth, I think is really important. And two other things that I'll mention. One is absolute relentlessness. It's a trait of mine. It's one that I've really honed over the years as a leader in information technology, because as I said, we're trying to sell things that nobody wants to buy, nobody understands, and they seem too expensive. So being relentless in the pursuit of doing what you know is the right thing to do on behalf of an institution or a company is kind of core to what we do. So I go back to the Churchill quote, never, ever, ever, ever give up. It's on my wall, and it's something that I really believe in. And that if you can't get there directly, don't stop and don't hit your head against that wall. Find another way around, figure it out in a different way. And I think that that competency and character trait of mine has helped a lot and is coachable. And then the last thing I'll say is Maya Angelou has one of my favorite quotes in the world, and this is not a precise quote, but people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And I approach my job as a relationship person. I mean, I want to know my staff. I want to know everybody's first names. I want to know their families and where they come from. You know, as the CIO, I'm on the highest stage, and I have to think about it that way, that the way I behave, the words that I use matter, and people notice them and they tuck them away for a future moment or confrontation, if you will. There was a guy at Bristol Hotels, I'm just last story, I promise. We hired this network engineer, junior network engineer from the Dallas Public Library. His name was Jeremy, and he joins the team at Bristol. And one day I'm taking the network team, which consisted of 4 people, out to lunch, which I would do regularly. And as we were walking to my car, Jeremy is about 15 feet behind me, and I hear him calling his father and saying, "You're never going to believe what I'm doing right now. I'm going to lunch with the CIO. It's amazing." And it was really a great moment for me to realize that, you know, I don't think of myself that way, but other people view me because of my title and where I sit. They view the role in that way. And so I have to show up every day as that person, and a person who I drive hard. I have very high expectations, but I never ask anybody to do anything that I'm not willing to lead. And I treat people with respect, no matter what the situation is. And I think that that story with Jeremy really helped solidify for me to be aware of my position and my behavior at all time in order to get the highest performance out of my team. And again, those are all things that I try to share and mentor. Some of them work, some of them don't, depending on who you are. But I think those are the real foundational elements that have allowed me to practice this now for 40 plus years.
Great stories all. I love that. The courage, humility, relentlessness, the recognition of how you're making the team feel and working backwards from that and the actions that you take. A really nice reflections, Tom. Thank you so much for those. In conclusion, I wanted to ask you, is there anything you're watching, listening to, reading that has you particularly intrigued that you might share, a recommendation you might provide to those who are listening or watching?
Well, I just finished Shogun, which
Ah,
I highly recommend. Much better than the last version. Really a beautifully done piece of work. I am I am rewatching. Well, I'm watching different parts of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. So I'm doing this whole Philadelphia theme right now. I've lived here since 2004. So I'm going back and I'm trying to teach myself more about Philadelphia. And there's nothing like It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia to really bring home what Philly's all about. And I'm listening constantly to War on Drugs, which is a band that started in Philadelphia and is now nationally known. I find their music amazing, almost as good as Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, but not quite as good.
But in that same vein, is it sort of the successor to him in some ways, or?
Oh no, Nick Cave, who is my favorite all-time artist, is a different artist from War on Drugs.
Well, good suggestions all. I appreciate you sharing those as well, Tom, and thank you for all the perspectives you share from across your many stops of consequence, as noted throughout this conversation, and especially the latest one at the University of Pennsylvania. Again, as an alum, thank you for the great work that you continue to do at Penn, and thank you so much for taking a little time today to share a bit about it.
Thank you, Peter, and it's always great to spend time with you. I appreciate it.